More interested in war than the army, from SAS Rogue Heroes, the Authorised Wartime History, by Ben MacIntyre. With JLO now back in enemy hands, the SAS and the LRDG needed a new forward base from which to continue desert operations. The most logical was the oasis at Siwa, 30 miles inside Egypt from the Libyan border in the eastern part of the Great Sand Sea on the edge of the Qattara Depression. A former fortress of the Senussi tribe, built around the ancient Greek temple of Ammon, Siwa Oasis was a far cry from the mosquito-ridden discomfort of JLO. Clear natural springs frothed out of the ground, creating a vivid splash of greenery in the desert, with towering date palms and neatly tended olive groves. Cleopatra herself was said to have swum in the natural stone pool that was fed by a hot spring. There were a few European houses, as well as a sprawl of traditional villagers' huts. Fitzroy MacLean was enchanted by Cleopatra's pool and immediately jumped into it. Under palm trees were pools of clear water bubbling up from great depth. It was like bathing in soda water. Stirling's attention had turned to Benghazi. For more than 2,500 years, the competing forces had fought over this ancient Mediterranean seaport. Greeks, Spartans, Persians, Egyptians, Romans, Vandals, Arabs, and Turks. The Italians had invaded in 1912, ruthlessly oppressing the locals and building a charming seafront of Italianate villas. Benghazi flourished as a showcase for Mussolini's imperialist vision, and by 1939, some 20,000 Italians were living in this thriving colony with shops, restaurants, and a cinema. In February 1941, it had been captured from the Italians by British and Commonwealth forces in the first major Allied military action of the Western Desert Campaign. 2 months later, it was recaptured by Rommel's Afrika Korps. The port was seized back by the Allies on Christmas Eve, only to change hands once again barely a month later as Rommel's forces swept eastward. A vital target in the Seesaw War, Benghazi and its surrounding airfields had taken on strong symbolic as well as strategic significance. With Tobruk back in Allied hands, Benghazi was the essential supply port for the Afrika Korps, while the nearby airfields, Birka, Benina, Barse, Slonta, and Regima, were vital to the Axis air forces in the battle for supremacy over the Mediterranean. The 5 Italian soldiers manning the roadblock into Benghazi were surprised when a German staff car, with half a dozen passengers, pulled up at the barrier at 11:15 in the evening on the 21st of May 1942. The car and its occupants did not seem particularly worthy of attention. The Germans were always rushing about at odd hours, but the noise it was making most certainly was. A strange, high-pitched metallic scream, audible from a distance of half a mile, that died away as the car came to a stop. Something had knocked the wheels out of alignment, and the bearings were protesting at maximum volume. The car was being driven with full beam headlights, even though German regulations stated that all cars driven at night should have dimmed lights to reduce the danger of aerial attack. The man in the front passenger seat spoke with a strong foreign accent. "Militari," said Fitzroy MacLean, who had not spoken Italian for about 3 years. The Italian sentry, armed with a machine gun, looked vaguely quizzical. "Staff officers, di Stato Maggiore," added MacLean. "Di freddo, in a hurry." Another Italian soldier was standing off some 30 yards to the right. 3 more, carrying rifles, observed proceedings from beside the guard hut. All had bayonets fixed. Behind him, MacLean heard the ominous click of a safety catch being eased off the Tommy gun in the hands of the man behind him. Cooper had drawn his knife in the darkness. In MacLean's left hand, he held a half-eaten bar of chocolate. In his right, out of sight, he clutched a large spanner with which he planned, if necessary, to brain the Italian sentry. The soldier lifted the bar and waved the car through. "You ought to get those dimmed," he said, pointing at the headlights. As the wail of the wheels rose once more, David Stirling accelerated into the night towards Benghazi. The Italian sentry would have been astonished to discover how close he had come to being clubbed senseless by a British Member of Parliament. He would have been still more stunned to learn that a pair of heavy-caliber machine guns had been hidden on the floor, and that the vehicle contained 2 inflatable rubber boats and enough explosives to demolish half of Benghazi. But he would surely have been utterly flabbergasted by the revelation that the tubby man seated in the middle of the back seat was one of the most prized potential prisoners of war, Captain Randolph Frederick Edward Spencer Churchill, the son of Britain's wartime Prime Minister. Randolph Churchill was a tricky personality and a divisive figure, a frustrated son who had spent most of his life trying, and largely failing, to impress his celebrated father. He was opinionated, bad-mannered, and often very drunk. At moments of frustration, he tended to burst into tears. As the heir to a great name, he was cruelly nicknamed Randolph Hope and Glory. But he was also clever, generous, and astonishingly courageous. He had come out to the Middle East with lay force, and when the commando unit was disbanded, he took over the propaganda section of Middle East HQ. Jock Lewes, who admired few people, had liked him. Much too outspoken and militant in his convictions to be popular, but he put his heart into me and by his robust and healthy character. Stirling was also fond of Churchill, though not without reservations. A likeable chap, but dear me, he could talk. He just couldn't resist holding forth about how the war should be handled. But he was certainly brave enough. Stirling had allowed Churchill to join L Detachment, although he was hardly cut out for the rigours of desert warfare. On his first parachute jump, Randolph hit the ground hard because, in Stirling's uncompromising assessment, he was just too bloody fat. Churchill wrote to his father in glowing terms about the new unit and its commander. I am extremely happy where I am. My commanding officer, David Stirling, is a very great friend of mine. He is only 25 and recently got the DSO for his attacks on German airfields. At the moment, the unit must have 121 enemy aircraft to their credit. Apart from Bob Laycock, he is the most original and enterprising soldier I have come across. Not being a regular soldier, he is more interested in war than in the army. He is one of the few people who think of war in three-dimensional terms. This was a most perceptive observation, and one that cut to the essence of Stirling's approach. Unlike most officers who thought in linear terms and cared about promotion, medals, and the steady progression of the battlefront, Stirling approached warfare sideways and from an amateur perspective. Killing the enemy was only one aspect of the process. If, using surprise and guile, the enemy could be disorientated, alarmed, and embarrassed, then the three-dimensional impact could be far greater than traditional tactics. After much badgering, Stirling reluctantly agreed to allow Churchill to come on the Benghazi raid, on the understanding that he would not take part in the action, but remain with the vehicles at the LRDG rendezvous. There was more than a little calculation in this. Churchill was invited along as an observer to see the fun. A journalist by training, he was certain to report back to his father on the daring qualities of the SAS, and the more support Stirling could get from the top, the better he would be able to circumvent the obstructive elements in the middle of the military machine. After the first failed foray into the harbour, Stirling had refined the Benghazi plan. If two large ships could be mined and sunk at the harbour entrance, this would block the port, temporarily paralysing Axis seaborne supply lines. If Rommel could be starved of food, fuel and ammunition, then the deadlock might be broken. Even if the impact was only temporary, the effect on the German and Italian morale might be significant. More troops would have to be deployed to defend the ports. Rommel could be made to look backwards, defensively, rather than east towards Cairo. A single spectacular raid on Benghazi might change the course of the war. Aerial photographs and intelligence reports confirmed a small strip of shingle between the jetty and the harbour wall, ideal for launching small craft. It was agreed that the RAF would launch a bombing raid on the harbour the night before the attack to divert enemy attention. Fitzroy MacLean was detailed to find boats that could be relied on, unlike the fickle foal-boats. The only requirement, as Stirling put it, was that they had to bloody well work. MacLean obtained 2 rubber dinghies, small and black and handy, that could be swiftly inflated with a pair of bellows. The bellows emitted a loud asthmatic wheeze, but otherwise the boats appeared to be ideal. To test them, Stirling carried out a dummy raid against the Allied shipping in Suez Harbour, which proved to be almost as inadequately defended as Benghazi. While a passing British soldier spotted 3 men inflating a boat in the middle of the night beside the harbour and asked them what they were doing, he received the following response: "Never you mind, fuck off," which he did. The raiders planned to employ exactly this tactic if challenged in Benghazi. The party would consist of Sterling and Maclean, Seekings and Cooper, Gordon Alston, an intelligence officer who had spent 3 weeks in Benghazi during the latest British occupation, and Johnny Rose, a former manager of a branch of Woolworths and an expert mechanic who would keep the Blitz buggy running. Churchill would come along in the capacity of official observer. The 400-mile drive to the Benghazi escarpment took 5 days. Maclean marvelled at the beauties of the changing desert. Sometimes flat, sometimes broken and undulating, sometimes sandy, sometimes hard and stony, a mixture of greys, browns, yellows and reds, all bleached by the sun and merging into each other. The wilderness was dotted with patches of scrub and low grass, from which dashed frightened gazelles, hardly bigger than hares, as the convoy rumbled past. In the cold of the morning, the men drove huddled in greatcoats, but as the sun rose, they gradually stripped down to shorts and the Arab headscarves, adopted as an unofficial part of the SAS uniform. Apart from their romantic appearance, they were extremely practical, wrote Maclean, as a sun shield, dishcloth and face mask to keep off the flies and the sand. Crossing the ancient caravan route, the Trig al-Abd, Maclean noted the desiccated bones of camels, and no doubt men who in the course of centuries had fallen by the way and been left to die. Further on, they passed the charred shells of tanks and trucks, some still containing corpses, victims of the winter fighting. Somewhere to the north lay the bones of Jock Lewes.